Hugs, an Pragya one-shot fanfiction by Mina. I didn't want to be just another cliché, the school nerd who was hopelessly in love with the popular boy, so I never let anyone know that I felt anything for him at all. Mostly, I just pretended to be indifferent, though sometimes we would get into taunting wars because he just can't keep his mouth shut. Honestly, he is and has always been purely made of sass. We didn't see much of each other in that last year of school, as our official status was only friends of friends, and we didn't have any classes together. So graduation day came upon us suddenly, and I shouldn't have been surprised when he pulled me into a hug. He hugged everyone that day, one after the other. Still, I had never been that close to him before, and even though it only lasted 30 seconds, I lost my head while in his arms. To feel his firm grip, his hard chest, the rasp of his stubbled cheek against my skin, to drown in that Old Spice scent that was subtler with him than the clouds of Axe favored by the other boys, to know that my chin fit just exactly right on his shoulder. I just kept thinking, if only, and what could have been, and for 30 seconds I forgot everything I knew about what I could and couldn't have in life and just got to have him. But of course he let me go with complete ease, no sign of being affected at all. And why would he be? He took Thanu to prom, as everyone expected. They had this on-again, off-again thing for the last 2 years of school. He never called it a relationship, though she definitely liked to say, my boyfriend Abhi, as much as possible. He looked stupidly gorgeous with her designer gown coordinated to his bespoke suit. I did my best not to look at them, but they were kind of hard to miss, always the center of attention. He managed to get away from Thanu for about 10 minutes after dinner, and he came by our table to chat with Burab. When he turned to leave, he finally saw me, and he got that annoying grin on his face, and I knew he was about to say something infuriating. Sure enough, he fulfilled my expectations with an obnoxious wolf whistle as he smirked and commented, Well, 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 who are you, and what have you done to Chashmish? The lehenga's nice, but don't you think it's dangerous to be walking around blind? I'm wearing lenses, I snapped back, and because it was prom and we were all a little giddy with excitement, I let my inner 6-year-old come out to play and stuck my tongue out at him. He laughed. Don't ever change, Chashmish, he said, and he patted my shoulder and went back to Thanu, and that was that, the last interaction I'd ever have with the wannabe rock star I'd been crushing on since 7th grade. Fast forward 3 years, and I walked into the most ridiculous surprise of my life on the 3rd day of term, because the most unlikely person was sitting in on my feminist approaches to law class. I actually didn't recognize him at first because his hair was neat and his face was clean-shaven, and he wasn't wearing his standard leather jacket and loose v-necks over distressed jeans. He actually looked like the picture-perfect definition of a college boy, wearing a preppy sweater over a collared shirt. And get this, he even had glasses, thin, black-rimmed wire frames with sleek rectangular lenses. I'm not going to lie, I totally sat down next to him thinking, he's cute and I bet he's really smart, I have to get to know him. He recognized me before I recognized him, and if it hadn't been for the professor starting class the next minute, a very strange and loud reunion would surely have ensued. As it was, we started exchanging notes on a piece of paper he pulled from his notebook, and we missed most of the introductory lecture. I found out over the rest of the term that he was still a wannabe rock star, but his dadi and taya had convinced him to finish college first to have something to fall back on, quote-unquote. He just transferred into my university after 2 years out of town because he wanted to live at home again. He swore he only wore the glasses to see the board, and it was true, he would always take them off as soon as we walked out of the classroom. I spent a lot of time with him that semester, discussing and arguing about the readings and working together on the papers and exam prep. I really liked being around him because he was still funny and relaxed, but he had this serious side too, and a surprising intelligence. I mean, growing up you'd never think he'd be the type to take a feminist law class, let alone write the papers a week ahead of time, and then score top grades. But I guess he'd really been hiding a lot behind that rockin' persona. He was always a bundle of contradictions. Cool as ice to the world, but the warmest heart to his friends. Completely modern outside the home, but at the same time, utterly devoted to his dadi and upholding his family. I didn't feel those annoying attraction feelings from high school anymore. He became my friend, and I liked spending time with him, and that was it. I didn't daydream about what it would be like if he would only just see me. I didn't get stupidly excited every time our hands touched. I didn't blush when he said that he liked my earrings or my kurta or whatever random thing he would find to compliment. I know what you're thinking, the lady doth protest too much, but I really do mean it. For those 4 months, I only saw him as a friend. I think it was in part because he was really serious most of that semester. I guess he had stuff going on that he didn't want to talk about. Whatever the reason, despite his generally cheerful and laid-back mood, he was definitely closed off emotionally. And that kept me from falling too much, I think. And of course, for my part, there was engagement to Suresh. Ma had finalized the rishta with his family at the end of the summer. I never saw him because he was away finishing his army service, and I wouldn't be seeing him much for a while because after that he was going to live in Delhi to finish up his master's. But we wrote to each other a lot, and we talked on the phone once a week, and over the course of the semester, I never told him about my new old friend Abhi. But then again, I never told Abhi about my fiancé-to-be either. Abhi didn't date at all that semester, but I think it had to do with whatever personal problem was keeping him so seriously focused on school. He told me Thanu was still sort of part of his life, though he could never predict when she would suddenly want to talk to him or come for a visit, so he didn't count it as a relationship or even a friendship. He never asked me about my personal life, and I assumed he thought that I didn't have one. It was the kind of arrogant assumption he'd have easily made when we were in school, and of course back then he would have been right. But then when we were having celebratory coffee after our final exam, he started teasing me about whether I'd ever gotten around to having a boyfriend. And then, of course, I had to tell him about the engagement. He went silent for a while, and then he asked me a few questions about whether I was happy and what our plans were. He vaguely knew Suresh as a family friend since we were all in the same community, but as Suresh was 6 years older, it wasn't much of an acquaintance. At the end of our conversation, he offered me congratulations and gave me a hug, and to my horror and delight, after a wholly platonic semester, that same old thing happened. For the 30 seconds I was in his arms, I forgot that the rest of the world and the rest of my life even existed. But then it was over, and I told myself I hadn't felt anything disturbing at all. One afternoon I took Ma to her appointment, and since there was nothing for me to do for the hour that she'd be with the nurses, I decided to walk to the hospital cafe for some tea. On the way I had to pass the intensive care ward, and to my surprise there was a very familiar someone leaning against the wall with his head in his hands. He was back to his distressed jeans and leather jacket look, and his glasses were nowhere in sight, and now he was even wearing some really silly dangling dog tags around his neck. It looked like he'd finally made it as a rock star, but I knew that serious scholar Abhi was probably still buried deep inside somewhere. I went up to him and touched his shoulder, and then as soon as he saw who I was, he just pulled me into a hug. It was incredibly bizarre to have him crying on my shoulder. We hadn't seen each other in years, and he was 4 inches taller than me and ridiculously muscled, so really he shouldn't have felt so fragile in my arms, but he did. After a while, he recovered enough to explain that his dadi was hospitalized, and it was looking grim, and he didn't know what to do. I didn't have much to tell him, but suddenly I decided that the best thing to do would be to take him to the hospital mandir. I told him to follow me, and he did, because he was as trusting as a puppy. Somewhere along the years, he had really accepted me as a friend, and his heart was still open to me despite the many years we'd been apart. I knew he didn't believe in that stuff, but he was at his lowest and most desperate, and sometimes in those moments, the most unexpected things can be a comfort. He followed my lead, and we both offered a short prayer. Afterwards, he told me he hoped God would listen to me, since he didn't expect him to even hear his voice. He thanked me for caring about his dadi. Then we hugged again, and I had to leave because it was time to pick up Ma. I found out from the papers that his dadi made a full recovery. After that followed 2 years' worth of headlines about his rising fame, and then suddenly I was living in a world where everyone knew his name, and had his poster, and could sing his songs by heart, and it was utterly surreal to think that once upon a time he was just a boy I'd had a crush on, stuck my tongue out to, written notes in college classes with, and hugged while he cried in a hospital. I didn't expect to see him again, especially not now that he was a big star. But life seemed to have other plans for us. Ma had worked her way through most of the city's matchmakers over the years, and by the time I was 27, she was hanging all her hopes on one of the last aunties we were referred to. This auntie's services were a bit beyond our budget, and to be honest, the family she was allied with were really not in our range at all for matching, but Ma was desperate and starting to get a bit delusional. Abhi's information and picture were presented to me under his official name, not his rockstar wala name, and I couldn't believe it. I had to know why he was going through this whole process, so I agreed to meet up with him. Apparently he wasn't even deciding who to meet with, his dadi was, and so when he got to the restaurant, he didn't even know it was going to be me. We talked, and I found out all about his wacky life. He said he was doing this because he would do anything for his dadi. He knew his dadi wanted him to marry someone who would help him settle down, and though that wasn't his priority, he definitely wanted to find someone he could trust to take care of his dadi and his family since his career kept him away so much. He remembered then that I was supposed to have been married half a decade ago, and I had to tell him the whole sad story of Suresh, which now had the punchline of him having recently gotten involved with my younger sister. He was appalled at that, but I reassured him that I didn't care. We talked a lot about marriage and expectations and the matching process that day, but we never seriously talked about marrying each other. We kept in touch after that meeting, and I kept him up to date on all the losers I had to meet, and he told me how the matchmaking lady was having a tough time finding girls who wanted him for more than his fame, so he was actually meeting with fewer and fewer women as the months went on. To cut a long story short, we got closer than we had ever been before, talking and meeting over almost a year to share our miseries about the whole business of marriage making. For my part, I kept telling myself that I would start pulling away from him soon because those attraction feelings were back, but they'd evolved into something more powerful and terrifying and unnameable. And since I cared about my sanity, I absolutely should and would save myself from heartache and get him out of my life right away. I told myself this after every lunch date and every evening phone call, and every time I believed myself, but then he'd call or text again and I forgot all about that resolution. As always, I did everything I could not to show that I felt anything but friendship for him. And as far as I could tell, he too always saw me as a friend. But there's such a thing as willful blindness, and to be honest, there was a lot that a sensible girl should and would have seen that I chose not to see because I was afraid to deal with the implications. Thankfully, he's never suffered from this kind of fear, and one day he just told me that the only sensible thing for us to do was get married. No self-consciousness or awkwardness or anything. I told him that there was one test for that decision. And sure enough, when we hugged, it was just like it had always been. It felt like the rightest and only place to be. And I thought I still didn't want to be a cliché, but if it still felt this way after so many years, and if now he felt it too, then he was right. There was only one sensible thing to do. The end.